A prominent American pollster at the Center for Policy Studies, a think tank which was founded by Margaret Thatcher, has said, quote, wokeism and culture wars are set to be the biggest dividing lines in British politics. Frank Luntz, who has advised the likes of George W. Bush, says that the cultural divisions in Britain will soon catch up with those seen in the United States, as the conflict and divisions caused by woke cancel culture will go on and on.
The study, which polled thousands of people, found that woke versus non-woke is a greater dividing line than young v old, and even the north-south divide. The divide in Britain is on everything, Luntz says. On just about every single issue, there is a chasm within the country.
Well, joining us now is pollster and Conservative peer, Lord Robert Hayward. Thanks for joining us this morning, Lord Robert Hayward. Is this something you recognise, these findings, that this woke versus non-woke divide could be set to be the biggest dividing line in British politics?
Yes, there's no question. It is a change that's taking place. We've seen it in relation to Brexit. And in fact, two of the things you've just been referring to, for example, the question as to whether police officers should have a degree and the question of colonialism, is the sort of thing that divides the country. If you get outside London, there is a distinct difference in attitude. And we've seen some shift take place in polling, in voting habits, but it isn't complete by any stretch of imagination.
That's because you don't ever see a ballot paper, even in recent by-elections, where you have vote woke here, vote anti-woke there. How does that manifest itself in this polarising influence that Frank Luntz and Policy Exchange claim it does?
I think it's fascinating that Boris Johnson is the sort of person who's actually managed to convey that message to the average member of the public. There are still old voting habits, and we saw that in Batley and Spen. But I think you'll probably find that many of the people who voted in Batley and Spen actually hold what one might describe as anti-woke attitudes. So the potential for further problems for the Labour Party is highlighted by this study.
And in this Times write-up of this polling, it says the term woke refers to someone concerned with social issues such as race and trans rights. Now, I take issue with that because I think, you know, ordinary people, everybody's concerned, has some concern with issues of racism and rights. So is there even agreement as to what this idea of woke means?
No, there isn't. And you're absolutely right, Mercy, that trying to define what people think it is too complex. But it's more the case of how people react to the issues rather than defining the issues. And if you take a positive, it'll solve itself, we'll get there sort of approach, you probably would be defined as anti-wokeism, anti-woke. You know, I'm gay, I'm an openly gay politician. I want to achieve change, not only in the question of attitudes towards gays and lesbians, but in relation to race, etc. But it's how you achieve that is probably whether you're pro or anti-woke.
Is it in the end that if you are not woke, you are happy to have to argue your case, make your case, win the argument? And there's something about woke that is not ever being confronted with a counter-argument to your own, and indeed with people who have a different view or a different outlook of life to yourself. Is that what it boils down to in the end?
It is. As far as people are concerned, it's also an aspect of tolerance. And the perception is that those who are aggressive in relation to changing attitudes are more aggressive, more intolerant. And Frank Luntz makes the point in his analysis that if you go for woke, there is no ultimate completion, because each time you solve one problem, you're on to the next, on to the next, on to the next.
In that sense, if that is the dividing line, then it serves the current, at least, Conservative Party better than it serves Keir Starmer and Labour.
It does, and the analysis quite definitely says there's an opportunity there for the Conservative Party. The Tories should not get carried away by their analysis, by that analysis. But there is the dichotomy that the Labour Party face in particular, that their membership in London is overwhelmingly what one would describe as woke, whereas its voting population in the Midlands and the North is actually probably anti-woke. There is a greater divide for the Labour Party, but it isn't easy street for the Tories either.
Well, one thing that struck me in this polling as well, I think the full polling will be published tomorrow, but this line, which was almost a footnote, it came at the very end of this write-up in the Times. It says the study found that just 42% of voters believe they're invested in the UK, and just 27% believe the UK is invested in them. I mean, that's quite tragic, isn't it? Over half of people don't think they're very invested in the UK.
It's an interesting line. I'm waiting to see the further information. It is concerning, but what I thought was more interesting overall was the broadly positive approach that the voters, those participating in the survey, were actually taking both towards their life and life in the UK.
And I think this on Friday we spoke about here on GBNews Emmanuel Macron, some interventions he's made over the last few days. In Elle magazine, he did an interview where he was very, very harsh, very critical about this idea of wokeness and identity politics. Obviously, France is a very universalistic country in their political culture. I was quite pleased to see a politician coming out and sort of speak very firmly about how divisive identity politics is, because I personally agree with that. Do you think we'll see anything like that with the Conservative Party? They've been quite keen to get involved in some of the cultural debates. Would that be something you welcome?
I think you have to approach it with caution. I think actually my experience talking to French friends is that British society is much more liberal, much more open than French is. But I think you have to approach this matter with caution, because if you try and address it too aggressively, then what you finish up with is dog whistle politics. And Zach Goldsmith suffered as a result of that when running for mayor a few years ago, running for mayor in London a few years ago.
Yeah, that was pretty brutal. In the end, I had a chat with Frank Luntz a couple of weeks ago, and a tough question for him, really. We both sort of reflected on it. When you say you're not very woke, for some people it's an insult, for some it's a compliment. How do you reconcile the two? Because it is a great dividing line, but in terms of society, a lot of people will take it as an insult to say you're not very woke. It's like saying you're not very empathetic, you're not very sympathetic, you don't care about others, you're insensitive. How do you actually combat woke without somehow ending up being hammered yourself in a different way?
I think the answer to that is probably move outside London, because there is quite definitely a divide. In London, it would be considered an insult. People would be offended. But as far as much of the rest of the country is concerned, they'd say, well, relax a bit, get on with it, and we'll solve the problems. They take a more positive attitude, a less interventionist attitude. But there's no question that social media is dominated by people who are aggressive in terms of saying intervene, whereas the non-interventionists, if I can use that word, are people who probably don't participate so much on social media and are less concerned about it.
Well, Lord Hayward, thanks for your time this morning. And we always have to remember Twitter isn't real life. So I think it's always the Twitter crowd that are what he calls the interventionists.
And the paradox of woke, to be stridently pro-woke is not to be very woke in itself.